It's a great pleasure to have Kelly Smith with us to give a talk as part of this seminar series. Kelly's a professor at the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Clemson in South Carolina. And he's also the president of the Society for Social and Conceptual Implications in Astrobiology. And how do we pronounce that? Socia?
Socia.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Which organizes a conference every 2 years. So is the next one in Finland next year, Kelly?
No, because of COVID, the next one will be at University of Mississippi here in the US. But the one after that, the 2024 conference, we're hoping Finland or thereabouts.
Oh, I see. Okay, great. So just to add, Kelly co-edited a volume called Social and Conceptual Issues in Astrobiology with Oxford University Press. That came out last year. And if you like this talk, he's giving another talk on March the 19th. So that's a week on Friday. And that's called First Do Nothing, a Passive Protocol for First Contact. So if anyone fancies that, they should get in touch and we can tell you how to join that meeting as well. But for now, Kelly's going to talk about the immorality of METI, why friends shouldn't let friends message aliens. So please go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen because I've got a PowerPoint. Okay, can everybody see that? No, okay, good.
Yeah.
So my approach for this kind of stuff, I figure this is the sort of audience where it's so diverse that it's better not to try to figure out what you really want to talk about. And so what I'm going to try to do is give my major argument against messaging aliens. And then I'm going to talk about some objections and replies. And the idea is to give you just enough detail so that you can formulate a good question or two, and then we can talk about that in the discussion. I think that's better than getting into the details of some of these arguments that people may not care about. And this is the reference for a much more extensive discussion of these things if you want to look at it. So this is the perfect cartoon to introduce this message. I paid $65 to have the rights to put this in my book. But it's a good introductory cartoon. I'll just read it. What's that called where we try to find any alien messages? That's SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. What if we send messages into space? That's called METI, or Messaging Extraterrestrial Intelligence. What's it called if those aliens come to attack Earth? That's called Regretti, Reckless Endeavor, Goofily Revealed Earth to Invaders. And of course, it's funny, and you know, it sort of focuses on something that we probably shouldn't be worried too terribly much about, but there's a point there. So I always start these talks, because I don't know exactly who's in the audience, with a gee whiz slide or two. This is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field study, or a close-up of it. Basically, you point the Hubble at a section of the sky that is as uninteresting as you can find. It's about the size of a dime held at arm's length. There's nothing there to the visible eye. And over 10 days, you collect every photon, and every dot in this picture is a galaxy containing roughly 100 billion stars. Each star has on average at least one planet. So in a very uninteresting section of the sky, there's quadrillion stars or whatever. So the universe is a huge place. And according to the Drake equation, which I hope most people have at least heard about, you can sort of bootstrap your way to getting a quasi-scientific estimate of the likelihood that there will be aliens out there to talk with. I won't go through this in any detail, but basically it just amounts to, you take the number of stars and you multiply that by the percentage that they have planets, and then habitable planets, and then life, and then intelligent life, et cetera, et cetera. And I went to the Green Bank Observatory not long ago, and this is a picture of the Drake conference room at the Green Bank Observatory. That plaque on the wall there commemorates Drake coming up with this equation in that room. And then of course the table is set with all the accoutrement that probably helped Drake to come up with this, all the liquor and stuff like that. So, we've been passively sending messages into space since 1901 with Marconi's first radio transmission. In 1936 with the Olympic Games being broadcast from Germany. So in some sense, you could argue that in a 120 light year sphere around Earth, there's all the electromagnetic garbage that Earth has been throwing off for quite some time. That's not as telling as you might think. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on, but it is true that in principle, we can be detected 120 light years away. There've been at least 31 attempts to intentionally beam messages to potentially inhabited worlds. And I say at least 31 because there isn't even a requirement right now to keep track of them all. So we know of 31, but there might be more. Most of these are publicity stunts of one type or another. So they open a new radio observatory and they beam a message off. Pepsi hired a radio observatory to send a Doritos commercial into space. And just recently, Lexus hired someone to send the sound of a Lexus engine into space. I guess the idea was that the aliens would be impressed by the perfection of the noise. But there are a couple of things happening now that are fundamentally different. METI International is a group of scientists, space scientists, who are going to be doing this in a very serious way. And the Interstellar Beacon project is the pet project of an amusement park millionaire who wants to beam Wikipedia into at as many systems as he can before he dies. And you might think that's not a serious attempt because it sounds stupid, but he's got enough money to rent the telescope time. So it may very well come to pass in the near future. Here are all the current restrictions on METI. It's actually a little bit of a simplification. There is sort of a loose agreement amongst radio astronomers that they will not reply to signals that come in from an alien without consultation, whatever that means. There are no restrictions whatsoever on first messages. So literally, if I have a friend who has a radio telescope and I can convince him to send a message at 3 a.m. wherever I want to, there's nothing to stop me. And I can announce that to the world and nothing will happen. So I think part of the problem here, and it sounds kind of silly to say it, but it's not a silly problem. People don't like to talk about aliens because they're worried that they're going to be labeled as crazy people, right? They think that, they're going to be labeled as UFOologists and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's slowly beginning to dawn on people, given the enormous progress we've made in the last 30 years, that astrobiology is becoming a real science. And there are certainly science-like arguments to be made. I mean, that's actually one interesting question about astrobiology, is whether or not, and in what sense, is it a science? Because it's inherently speculative, but you have things like the Drake equation, which use science to try to put parameters on things. In any event, it's only just now really occurring to the broader academic community that maybe this is not science fiction. It's probably latest coming to philosophers and anthropologists and people like that who are interested in these broader sorts of questions. But I would just ask, like, how much of a chance does there have to be that we would discover life beyond Earth, given that that's arguably the most important discovery humans will ever make, in order to risk a little bit of loss of face? And I think we're well past the point where it is a smart investment of people's time. Okay, so there's an argument that's being made by certain people in the space science community who are in favor of messaging. It's a very arrogant argument. It's extremely annoying, but unfortunately it seems to be winning the day. And it's really this kind of argument that pissed me off enough that I decided I needed to write a response. It basically amounts to, we're space scientists and we understand all this stuff. We've already bled all this electromagnetic radiation into space. So anybody within 120 light years already knows about us. And any aliens out there would be super duper nice anyway. So it's not like you have to worry about them coming and eating your brains or any of that kind of stuff. So there's no new risk that anybody needs to worry about here at all. And in addition to that, if we were to actually have anything like a public discussion, the public would go crazy and ban everything. Therefore, there's nothing to be gained by having any discussion, nothing to see here, move along, let the space science community do whatever we want to do. That's essentially the argument that's been made by some of the advocates here. And one of the things that I used to do a fair amount of is medical ethics. And so I thought there was an obvious parallel to be drawn here with medical ethics. In general, in the West, there are lots of caveats. This is not the way we did things in the 50s. It's not the way they do things in some other countries. But, in Western medical ethics, we don't think that it's okay to force patients to undergo treatment or to force them to take risks unless very specific conditions are met. For example, they're not competent, or consultation is simply not possible, like they're unconscious and they're bleeding to death, or other people might be harmed if they have a highly contagious lethal disease or something like that. And in particular, what we don't consider at all relevant is whether the treatment is in the best interest of the patient, in the opinion of the medical team, or whether the medical team believes that the reasons for refusing treatment are stupid, right? Even if those are true, we don't believe that that's adequate reason for overriding the patient's consent in general. And so you can make an argument about anti-Medi in much the same spirit, right? If it's a general principle that it's immoral to force people to take a risk without their consent, except in unusual circumstances, and Medi clearly poses a risk to all humanity, and there's no evidence of anything like consent or assent or consensus or however you want to put that, right? And none of the special circumstances apply, then pursuing Medi, at least at the current time, is just immoral, right? And then pretty much everything I'm going to say after this is going to be trying to sort of tease out some of the objections and replies that might be made to this. So, there are definitely risks involved. We could talk about this a lot if you want to, but I think the simplest way to put it is we know just probabilistically that any intelligence we make contact with is almost certainly going to be more advanced than we are, and not by a little bit, by thousands of years. And just think how far we've come in the last 2,000 years. So an alien intelligence that's 10,000 years more advanced than we are, much less a million, is going to be incomprehensible to us technologically in all likelihood. And whatever the message contains, people debate about what the message should contain, but in some sense, that's beside the point. Any signal is going to tell everybody that we're a fairly primitive species, right? Because we're still using radio communications, for God's sakes, right? And we live right here because the signal is directional. So aliens will be able to figure out exactly where the signal is coming from. And I submit to you, that is an excellent prima facie argument that we should be careful. Right? Is that you're going to be communicating our relative vulnerability and location to a very advanced race that could use that in all kinds of ways. Any other debate you have maybe changes the odds a little bit one way or the other, but that's enough to establish a clear risk. And in any event, the people who talk about this usually get stuck on trying to calculate absolute risk. It doesn't really matter from an ethical point of view. From an ethical point of view, what matters is acceptable risk, not absolute risk. Even if the absolute risk is very low, that's not the moral question. The moral question is, what are people willing to put up with? So I was on the Human Subjects Committee. I guess you have something similar in the United Kingdom, but every proposal dealing with human subjects has to go through the committee. And this conversation is a conversation I would have over and over and over again with principal investigators. I'd point out some risk and they'd say, well, that's stupid. If I put that in the informed consent, then potential research subjects are going to freak out. And I would say, thank you for making my point, right? Like it doesn't matter if the reason is stupid. If people freak out about it, that indicates that they want to know and they have the right to make stupid decisions. It's not up to you to make decisions for them. And this escapes social science researchers all the time, much less physical scientists like the space people who don't deal with human beings very often. And I'm just going to throw this out there. I don't know that I want to pursue it unless somebody really wants to get into it, but I have a suspicion, it's just that at this point, that truly existential risks, and aliens like this could pose an existential risk, not only to humans, but to all life on Earth. They may be in a different kind. They may be different in kind from other kinds of risks and require a different sort of approach for solving them. I'm not sure that's true, but I think it might be. I mean, because once you start talking about the extermination of all life, I'm not sure that calculating discounts on future generations is really the right way to go. So, the horse is already out of the barn argument. We've already told everybody where we are. The inverse power law basically says that if you're emanating a signal in all directions, like radio and television signals do, the power of the signal falls off with the square of the distance. So in other words, the power gets very weak very quickly. And although in principle, there is electromagnetic radiation from Earth 120 light years away, those transmissions were very weak. And by the time it's traveled 120 light years, it is unbelievably weak. So we're talking about something that would clearly be undetectable to human beings. Just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I talked to a radio communications expert, and he said that to actually watch I Love Lucy from 50 light years away, which is not much in astronomical terms, you would require an antenna the size of the entire solar system. Now we can wave our hands and say maybe aliens could do it with something the size of a pocket watch, and I can't gainsay that, but that's speculative, and I'll talk about speculation a little bit later on. The kinds of modern METI that we're talking about, though, they're not subject to the same kind of problem. You're talking about a situation where you take a very high power laser and you point it directly at a system that you believe contains habitable planets, and you beam them a message directly. That is many, many orders of magnitude more detectable, which you would think people would realize that's the point. People want to have it both ways. They want to say, well, we're not taking any new risk, but it's worth doing this. Well, if it's worth doing this, it's because the signal's more detectable, in which case you are taking more risk, period. There's no other way to put it. There's almost no data on public attitudes, at least about this kind of stuff. There's some data about space launches in general and things like that, but there's almost no data on this, which is kind of curious because it's not really that difficult to collect data. In fact, I got annoyed at one point and collected some data from students at Clemson about a year and a half ago, which I'm currently analyzing. But it's not, if I can do it, it's not that hard to do. The problem is that space scientists are not social scientists, and they don't think about surveys and actually caring what people think and stuff like that. Now, one of the special circumstances would be incompetence. So if you think that humanity is incompetent to weigh in on this decision, then that might be a way off the moral hook. But the competence that we're talking about is not the competence of a scientific expert. Otherwise, I wouldn't be allowed to weigh in on any of my medical decisions. And moreover, the kind of competence that we're talking about has to involve at least some familiarity with ethics and public policy. And I submit that there's no reason to think that space scientists are particularly adept at either of these. In fact, you could make an argument that they might be worse than average on either or both of these. Is there an emergency? Well, no. Given that even if there's life on Alpha Centauri and we were to send a message to Alpha Centauri right now, and we easily deciphered it when it came back, which is very unlikely, it would take at least 10 years or so to establish communication, at least. So that's an absolute rock bottom minimum, is at least 10 years. And it's much more likely to be on the order of hundreds or even thousands of years to get two-way communication going. There's really only one group that wants to do this right now, or that would benefit from doing this right now, and those are the space scientists who are arguing in favor of METI, which is at least curious, right? And then, as I say here, sort of tongue-in-cheek, in the ethics biz, we call this a conflict of interest. It doesn't mean that the space scientists who are making these arguments are necessarily slime buckets, but it should make you examine their motives very carefully to make sure that there's nothing going on here that would sort of bias them in a way that shouldn't happen. And there's a couple of straw men that advocates for METI use. One is this idea of consensus. I get this all the time when I talk about these kinds of things. There's just no way to get consent from all of humanity, right? And then people oftentimes start talking about getting informed consent documents signed by 8 billion people, and nobody proposes that, right? One thing you might say is, look, the UN and other international organizations do manage to get something like consent or consensus all the time. It happens all the time. It's not a great process. But on the other hand, it doesn't take much to beat whatever, anything goes, which is the current state of affairs. The other sort of related straw man is that it's impossible to regulate this, that the only way we could possibly regulate this is to have international laws with some kind of, UN police force that is going to enforce that. This is the kind of thing that people that don't deal with law say, because it's just not true. All kinds of regulation is accomplished, particularly in high-tech areas, through soft law, which is not even law, right? Soft law are regulations that don't have the force of law, that are voluntarily agreed to by organizations for various kinds of reasons. Best practices, for example. The vast majority of the kind of equipment that would be used for METI is owned by governments, right? And the scientists who operate them are very, conscious of their reputation. So having an agreement amongst all the operators of high energy lasers and radio telescopes would probably be perfectly feasible. There are already agreements like that in place on other issues. So it's just a straw man to say that somehow this is impossible. Now, there's speculation looms large whenever you start talking about aliens. And both sides employ it. In fact, it's not really possible to completely avoid speculation. But I do find that at least ironic if you have a scientist who's making an argument for METI, and that argument relies on speculation, because at that point, he shouldn't get points for being a scientific expert. He's not using scientific expertise to make the argument. He's speculating in a way that any science fiction writer, or for that matter, my 18-year-old son can do. So here's an example. Any aliens we discovered would definitely be more advanced. And by advanced, we just don't mean technologically. We mean advanced in every way, socially and ethically. And they'd be super benevolent, because if they weren't benevolent, they would have killed themselves a long time ago. So really, it's just sort of irrational to fear the other here. It's clearly the case that they would be super benevolent. That's a good example of an argument that I think has a certain amount of plausibility, but it's taken way too far, right? We don't understand social and ethical dynamics amongst human beings on Earth, right? Much less amongst an alien that we've never encountered. Evidence from Earth suggests that it's entirely possible to be highly advanced ethically and socially in some sense and still be horrible to certain kinds of people, particularly when you have technological dominance. So you don't have to worry about repercussions from that behavior. And then the final point, I think, which is all you probably need to say is, look, even if it's true that 99.9% of our extraterrestrial neighbors are super benevolent, it could be our bad luck to be in the part of the cosmic neighborhood that just happens to have a bad actor. And all it takes is one. How confident are you that we're not in that neighborhood? How much of a chance are you willing to take based on this theoretical argument about, the necessity of benevolence? And my friend John Traphagen, an anthropologist, has made an interesting twist on this, which I won't get into unless somebody wants to. But he's pointed out that we're always concerned with how this is going to affect people, but it's not at all obvious that first contact wouldn't have a deleterious effect on aliens, even advanced aliens, right? So if, for example, the aliens don't have a unified political structure and they don't welcome contact for whatever reason, then making contact with aliens could have a very, very bad effect on them. And that's something that we have to at least consider. So I want to, at the very end, sort of give what I think is the best argument in favor of METI. If we make contact with smart, benevolent aliens, they can give us all kinds of knowledge that saves us tons of pain. So they can teach us how to get world peace, and they can teach us how to cure cancer and whatever other gee whiz technological stuff you want, they can give that to us. I think that's probably the most likely scenario, just personally. So like if I was making a bet, that's what I would bet, that if we make contact with another alien, they're going to give us a bunch of stuff that's going to help us, right? Note that has nothing, that doesn't in any sense detract from the argument I made here, because it's not about my personal view and it's not about what's most likely to happen. It's about what my fellow human beings are willing to accept in terms of risk. So even if I'm right that this is the most likely scenario, in some sense, it's beside the point. And finally, I'll just say, I think there might be a careful what you wish for sort of angle here. I've talked to scientists who said that they would love to have this happen. And I think, well, it would be great for the first year or two when you're discovering, the principles that unify physics or whatever it is that lights your candle. But imagine 5 years down the road when every single human being has the status of a very dumb remedial science student. So science striving is no more. We cannot contribute to the massive database that the aliens have accumulated. The best we can do is spend our lives trying to catch up. And I don't think most scientists would be happy with that. The average person might not care, but most scientists, I think, would be very upset about that outcome. So lastly, I just want to say, Peter mentioned at the very beginning that I run an organization called SOCIA. It is the preeminent group exploring these broader questions. In fact, it's really the only one. The European Astrobiology Initiative is going to be doing more of this, thank goodness. NASA kind of distances themselves from this a bit. But I would suggest, particularly to junior people, that the return on investment here could be very high. I don't think it's a good idea to exclusively do astrobiological kinds of things, but to have a paper or two out to hedge your bets, should we find life on Mars or elsewhere, that strikes me as a pretty smart investment. Our whole 2020 conference, which was online, is available at socia.space. You can go look through all the talks. And you're welcome to email me if you want to join the listserv, or you want me to recommend, a physicist who does X or a chemist who does Y. I've got a big list of people in the group. Okay, with that, I'm going to shut up, and then I will just take questions and deal with whatever it is you guys want to talk about.
Thanks very much, Kelly. I'm going to use the chat function to look